He cleaned their floors every morning, never spoke, never complained. But behind that silence was a story no one dared to imagine. A story about the war, about the men he saved, about the medals he never wore, until the day the photo appeared and there was no more hiding. You're watching the Storyscape. Before we start, tell us in the comments, where in the world are you watching from right now? If you believe stories like this deserve to be heard, subscribe and be here for the next one. He didn't look like much. That was the first thing people always thought when they saw him. Just an old man in a plain tan jacket, the color bleached by too many summers, wearing the same scuffed boots day after day. His hair was mostly gone, a silver stubble around a crown of soft skin that had burned and healed and burned again under 100 skies no one had asked him about. Every morning at precisely 5:42 a.m., he would leave the tiny one-room apartment above the auto parts store, carrying a single paper bag folded tight at the top. Inside it was always the same: a thermos of black coffee, a peanut butter sandwich wrapped in wax paper, and an old paperback novel with the corners dog-eared beyond saving. He'd walk 2 blocks to the security office, unlock the door with a brass key so worn it felt smooth as glass, and start another day no one else noticed. The company called him contract security, but everyone knew he was just the night guard who never called in sick, never complained about pay, never asked for anything but the same overnight shift no one else wanted. Some of the younger employees laughed behind his back. They said he was too old to stop a real threat, that he probably couldn't even keep up with a teenager trying to steal catalytic converters off the lot. "Grandpa security," they whispered when they thought he couldn't hear. "He should be in a home, not here. Probably thinks this is still the Cold War." He never reacted, never looked up. If any of it got under his skin, he never showed it. He just sat in the tiny booth beside the security monitors, sipping coffee in the dark, watching the gates that nobody really believed would ever be tested, until the night the black SUV pulled up. No one knew exactly when it arrived. Some said it had been idling there since sunset. Others swore it appeared from nowhere around 3 a.m., the headlights off, the windows too dark to see inside. But everyone agreed, when the door finally opened and 2 men stepped out, something in the air shifted. These weren't local police, not rent-a-cops, not even the kind of federal agents who sometimes showed up asking about counterfeit parts. Their suits were too sharp, their posture too steady. They moved like men used to clearing buildings and kicking in doors, not filing paperwork. And they were looking for him.
He didn't look surprised when the taller of the 2 men said his name. Didn't flinch when the second produced a sealed envelope stamped with a seal no one recognized. He simply nodded once, as if he'd always known this moment would come, and took the envelope in hands that didn't tremble. By morning, the parking lot was crowded with rumors. Some said he'd been arrested. Others insisted he was some kind of spy, a fugitive hiding in plain sight. But no one could agree on why the FBI, or whoever they really were, had come to a dead-end warehouse in the middle of nowhere just to speak to a janitor with arthritis in his knees. When he returned the next evening for his shift, he walked the same slow steps, carrying the same folded lunch bag. But something was different. The employees who used to whisper now watched him with the uneasy fascination usually reserved for old war monuments, the ones no one dared touch, but everyone felt compelled to read about. And though he never raised his voice, never explained where he'd been that morning or what the envelope had contained, every person who saw him afterward felt the same quiet certainty. They had no idea who he really was, but someone important did. And whatever he'd done, whatever debt had been paid, or favor called in, it had earned him a respect none of them could begin to comprehend. Because sometimes, the most dangerous man in the room isn't the one shouting orders or brandishing weapons. Sometimes, He's just the old guard, with a paper lunch bag and a past he'll never tell you about. The next night was the first time the security office phone rang after midnight. It startled the dispatcher so much that she dropped her pen, clattering it across the concrete floor. Nobody ever called after hours, not unless there was a fire or an emergency the cameras hadn't caught. She cleared her throat and pressed the receiver to her ear. "Security office." A pause. Then a voice, male, clipped and cool in the way that made her skin prickle. "Is he there?" She swallowed. "I'm sorry, who?" "Mr. Rourke. Is he on duty tonight?" She looked through the glass window into the booth. He was there, same as always, reading his paperback, the old thermos steaming beside his elbow. He didn't look up. He never did. "Yes, he's here," she said carefully. "Good," the voice said. No introduction, no explanation, just a click as the line went dead. She hung up slowly, trying to make sense of the call, but no sense would come. When she turned to look again, she could have sworn, just for a moment, that his eyes weren't on the page at all. They were looking right back at her through the glass, as if he'd known every word of the conversation before she'd even picked up the phone. Some swore they'd seen a badge with an eagle crest they couldn't identify. Others insisted they'd glimpsed a second vehicle idling across the street, the driver never stepping out. One man claimed he'd recognized the older agent as a name he'd heard whispered on military bases, someone attached to operations you couldn't pull up on a Google search. Another said he'd caught a glimpse of the envelope's seal and thought it looked like something from an intelligence agency no one admitted existed. But nobody knew for sure, and Rourke wasn't telling. He came in, same as ever, nodding politely at the young mechanics who stumbled in for the dawn shift. He clocked in on the same punch card he had used for years, creased and stained, the ink almost unreadable. He poured his coffee, settled into the chair, and watched the monitors without a word. But something about the way he moved had changed. The limp was still there, but it looked less like weakness and more like a habit, a choreography he no longer needed but chose to maintain, as if it served some deeper purpose none of them could guess. Around 7 a.m., a delivery truck backed into the loading dock. The driver, a man who'd worked there a decade, hopped down from the cab and froze when he saw Rourke standing by the door, clipboard in hand. You don't usually come out here," he stammered. Rourke just held out the clipboard. "Routine check." The driver signed without question. When he looked up, he saw the old man's sleeve had shifted just enough to reveal a tattoo on his forearm. Faded blue ink that didn't look like anything you'd see in a catalog of military service emblems. It was simpler, older. Just 3 letters and a set of numbers too worn to decipher. But something in the driver's gut told him he was looking at the mark of a unit that didn't exist on paper. He didn't ask about it. He just nodded, climbed back into his truck, and drove off in silence. The staff started treating Rourke differently. At first, it was little things. A door held open longer than necessary. A coffee refilled without being asked. Conversations that died the moment he walked into earshot. But then the stories began to spread beyond the warehouse walls. Someone's brother worked for the sheriff's office and heard about the black SUV. Someone's cousin claimed to have a friend in federal law enforcement who said Rourke's name was on an old watch list. Not because he was a threat, but because he was an asset, too valuable to ever truly let go. Nobody knew how much of it was true, but by the end of the week, nobody cared. The legend was growing, and it was unstoppable. One evening, as the sun went down behind the storage yard,
Rourke stood alone at the chain-link fence, looking west. A young mechanic named Torres worked up the nerve to approach him, heart thudding so hard he thought it might choke him.
"Mr. Rourke?" he ventured. The old man didn't turn. He just kept watching the horizon. "Sure, I don't mean to pry, but are you okay after the visit?" It took a long moment before Rourke spoke, and when he did, his voice was quiet, almost too quiet to hear. "Son, some debts you pay in blood, some you pay in time." Torres felt a chill crawl up his arms. "But the ones that matter, you pay in silence." He turned then, meeting the young man's wide eyes with a look so calm, so steady, it didn't need any further explanation. Torres swallowed, nodded, and walked away, knowing he'd never ask again. That night, long after everyone had left, the dispatcher peeked into the security booth one last time. Rourke was still there, the monitors casting pale blue light across his lined face. His paperback sat closed on the desk, the envelope from the black SUV resting on top of it. She wondered if he ever planned to open it, or if he already knew what it said. Because sometimes the past doesn't need to knock on your door. It just waits patiently until the world around you is finally ready to remember. It happened on a Wednesday morning so ordinary, nobody could have predicted the way it would unravel. By 9 a.m., the warehouse floor was humming like any other day. Forklifts beeping, pallet jacks scraping across cracked concrete, the clatter of inventory scanning guns echoing through the rows. Rourke had taken up his usual spot in the security booth, one boot crossed over the other, a steaming cup of black coffee at his elbow. Most days, nobody paid attention to him beyond a nod or a polite, "Good morning, sir." But after the visit from the black SUV, people found themselves sneaking glances more often, a kind of curiosity mixed with an unease they couldn't explain. So when the phone on the wall rang at precisely 9:17 a.m., the entire shipping team stopped what they were doing. The sound cut through the warehouse like a blade. In the office, the dispatcher answered, voice already tight. "Security?" She listened. Her eyes widened. She looked through the glass at Rourke. "He's here," she said, almost whispering. This time, she didn't hang up when the line went dead. She stayed frozen in place, hand still clutching the receiver, pulse fluttering in her throat. 30 seconds later, the first SUV pulled into the loading dock. Unlike the one the week before, this one was armored, matte black, with reinforced bumpers, a small antenna flickering a red LED that pulsed every 3 seconds. The driver didn't get out immediately. Instead, the engine idled with a low, ominous growl. Then came the second SUV. Then a third. Within 5 minutes, the loading area was full of dark vehicles positioned in a perfect staggered formation, fronts angled outward, rear hatches facing the warehouse doors. No one spoke. Rourke turned, slowly, deliberately, and looked at the gathered warehouse crew, the men and women who had spent years working beside him without ever really seeing him. His eyes found the young mechanic, Torres, who had once asked if he was okay. In that moment, Torres felt the weight of all the unspoken history pressing down on him. Rourke inclined his head, just slightly. A gesture of respect so understated it almost went unnoticed. Then he turned back to the agents. "I'll ride in the second vehicle," he said. "Understood," the lead agent replied. And just like that, the convoy began to pull away. 3 SUVs and the unmarked van rolling out of the loading dock,
engines whispering as they merged into the early traffic. The only evidence they'd ever been there was the quiet stillness they left behind, a hush that felt as permanent as the scars nobody could see. It would be hours before anyone found their voices again. But when they did, it was only to ask one question. Who was he, really? The convoy disappeared into the waking city traffic as if it had never been there. But the air in the warehouse didn't go back to normal. It felt thinner, charged with the static left behind by something too large to fully comprehend. People returned to their stations in a daze. Nobody spoke above a whisper. Even the forklifts seemed to move more carefully, as though they too sensed they'd been in the presence of something impossible to name. Torres, the young mechanic, was the first to break the silence. He walked over to the security booth, still warm from where Rourke had sat, and ran his hand over the edge of the desk. He said he'd been in security work, but he never said. He stopped. Because the truth was, none of them knew what he could have said that would have prepared them for this. In the main office, the shipping manager replayed the scene in her mind. The black vehicles, the locked briefcase, the badge she didn't recognize but somehow understood was important. She thought about the day Rourke had first been hired. No resume, no references, just a quiet nod and a signature. Corporate had said he was cleared, background vetted at the highest level. At the time, she hadn't cared. It was just another warm body for a position no one wanted. But now, she opened her email and began typing a message to headquarters. She didn't know what to say, only that someone needed to know what had happened here. Outside, in the early heat rising off the asphalt, an older truck driver named Hal leaned against the fender of his rig, watching the taillights vanish down the road. He was the only one old enough to remember certain things, classified operations whispered about in half-drunk confessions during Vietnam reunions, rumors of men who never had official ranks but carried clearances higher than any general.
Hal lit a cigarette with shaking fingers. "I'll be damned," he muttered to no one. "They finally came to collect him." For the rest of the morning, the warehouse ran in a fog. Orders were processed, pallets moved, but every conversation circled back to the same unanswerable question. Who was Rourke? The older employees tried to piece together clues. The way he'd known how to fix the freight scanner when IT couldn't. How he'd never flinched when the alarm system tripped. The unassuming presence that somehow commanded respect without a word. But the younger ones just looked at each other and shook their heads. They'd laughed when he'd applied. They'd called him overqualified and told each other he was probably just a washed-up rent-a-cop trying to feel important. Nobody was laughing now. By midday, the first news vans started to circle. Someone had posted a blurry photo on social media, a single frame of Rourke standing between the two suited agents. The caption was simple: "They came back for him." Within an hour, it had been shared over 100,000 times. Reporters called the warehouse, voices eager and predatory. The manager told them nothing. She didn't know anything. By early afternoon, the regional director arrived in a tailored suit and a face tight with the strain of too many phone calls. He demanded to know why no one had contacted corporate sooner. The shipping manager met his gaze without flinching. "Would you have believed me?" she asked. He didn't answer. Instead, he walked out to the loading dock, stood in the space where the SUVs had been, and just stared at the empty asphalt. The truth was, even if someone had told him in advance, he wouldn't have understood. None of them would have. Because how do you explain a man like Rourke to people who measure worth in resumes and LinkedIn endorsements? How do you translate a lifetime of silent service into something that fits on a form?
It was the diner waitress who said it best that evening. She'd been serving Rourke coffee every Thursday night for the last 5 years. When the local paper sent a reporter to ask her if she knew anything, she didn't hesitate. He was the same every time. Polite, quiet, always left a tip, no matter how small the bill. The reporter prodded her for more. Details, gossip, anything. But she only shrugged. "You people think he was hiding," she said, her voice soft but unyielding. "You've got it backwards. He wasn't hiding. He was just done being seen." The reporter didn't understand, but somewhere in the back of her mind, she knew it was the closest anyone would come to explaining the truth. By sundown, the photo of the black SUVs had been picked up by national outlets. Commentators speculated breathlessly about covert programs, intelligence networks, buried missions,
But those who'd worked beside Rourke knew none of that mattered. What mattered was that every day he'd shown up before dawn, checked the locks, walked the perimeter, stayed until the last employee clocked out. He never bragged, never hinted, and when the day came to be claimed by the shadows he'd once served, he stood up without hesitation. By midnight, the warehouse was empty, lights dimmed, alarms set, and on the security desk, someone had left a note in block letters. He protected more than this place. He protected all of us. No one signed it. No one needed to, because everyone already knew. For 3 days, the warehouse remained the center of an attention it had never asked for. News crews loitered by the loading bays. Employees slipped in through side doors, heads down, trying to pretend their routines weren't forever altered. But eventually the cameras left, the trending hashtags faded, and the world, as it always does, moved on to the next headline. Except, inside those concrete walls, nothing was quite the same. On the first morning without Rourke, the shipping manager unlocked the office as usual. She switched on the lights, powered up her computer, and paused at the sight of the empty security booth. It looked smaller without him there, less certain. She walked over and rested her hand on the chair back, as if to expect to feel some trace of his presence. But there was only the faint smell of old coffee and the ghost of 1,000 silent hours. Later that day, a delivery came, addressed to her office. It was a sealed envelope with no return address, marked simply Operations Confidential. Inside was a single page, Notice of Clearance Confirmation. Beneath the bureaucratic text, in language just vague enough to say everything and nothing, was one line that made her sit back in her chair. Mr. Rourke's assignment has concluded successfully. All relevant protocols have been observed. She read it twice, then a third time. No instructions, no further clarification, just the quiet, final acknowledgement that whoever he was, whatever he had been, his time here was over. Out in the warehouse, Torres and Hal were repairing a forklift battery when the topic inevitably returned to Rourke. "You think he's gone for good?" Torres asked. Hal didn't look up from the cables. "Son," he said, voice low, "a man like that is never really gone. He just stops letting you see him." Torres didn't answer, because in his gut, he knew it was true. That evening, the regional director gathered the entire staff in the break room. He tried to explain the situation without explaining anything at all. That Rourke had served his country in ways they'd never fully know. That his employment here was a contingency measure. That his departure was final
and not subject to discussion. When he finished, no one spoke, not because they had no questions,
but because somehow, deep down, they understood the answers were not theirs to claim. 2 weeks later, the small framed photograph arrived. It came by registered mail, unannounced, no note included. A black and white print, grainy but unmistakable. A group of men in desert fatigues, standing in front of a battered, armored convoy. Their faces were smudged with sand and exhaustion, but their eyes were alive with something unspoken, a bond forged beyond rank or fame. In the center, younger but unmistakable, was Rourke, one hand resting on the shoulder of a teammate, the other clutching a rifle across his chest. Someone mounted the photo on the break room wall. Someone else added a small brass plaque underneath. Service beyond acknowledgement. Over the months that followed, employees came and went, but a quiet custom emerged. Every morning before shifts began, someone would stop and look at that photograph. Sometimes they'd touch the frame. Sometimes they'd just stand there in silence. No one announced this ritual. No one required it. But it became a way of saying what no policy memo ever could, that some people walk among us carrying histories too heavy to share, and that respect is owed, even when understanding is impossible. Occasionally, new hires would ask about the man in the picture. They'd be told a version of the story, simplified, softened, easier to process. But the old hands never forgot the details. The morning the SUVs came, the agents in dark suits, the moment when Rourke stood without hesitation and stepped into the unknown, as if answering a call only he could hear. One cold morning in January, nearly a year later, Torres was finishing a shift when he noticed something wedged in the edge of the security booth door. A single envelope, aged and creased. Inside was a note, handwritten in blocky script. Don't measure a man by where he finishes. Measure him by what he carried when no one was watching. No signature, but Torres knew exactly who it was from. He folded the note carefully, slid it into his breast pocket, and for the first time since that day, felt something like peace. Some stories don't end in medals or headlines. Some end the way they began, quietly, with one man disappearing back into the silence he never truly left. And in the corner of the break room, under the flickering fluorescent light, the photograph remained. A reminder that somewhere, the man they thought they knew was still watching over them, just from a distance.
no one moved to unload inventory. From inside the booth, Rourke hadn't shifted a single inch, but those closest to the glass could see his eyes weren't fixed on the monitors anymore. They were watching the entrance, waiting. When the first door opened and two men stepped out, tall, black suits, dark sunglasses, and a composure so complete it felt inhuman, everyone finally understood. This wasn't a rumor. This wasn't a misunderstanding. Something was happening. The agents didn't approach the shipping manager or the dispatcher. They walked straight to the security booth. Their shoes made no sound on the concrete. Even the wind seemed to die as they passed. Someone whispered, "Jesus Christ," under their breath. One of the agents raised a hand, not to knock, just a gesture of acknowledgement. Rourke set his coffee down and stood up. For a moment, nobody breathed. The lead agent inclined his head slightly, voice low but carrying perfectly. "Sir, it's time." Rourke didn't ask for clarification. He didn't demand credentials or proof. He simply reached for his jacket, folding it over one arm. As he stepped out of the booth, he looked taller, straighter. The limp was still there, but it was no longer the shuffle of an old man. It was the controlled gait of someone whose body had paid a price in service most could never comprehend. One of the mechanics dropped his scanner, the plastic shell cracking against the floor. The noise didn't even register. The agents parted, allowing Rourke to step between them. Another vehicle rolled forward, a nondescript van with tinted windows. When the side door slid open, a man emerged wearing civilian clothes. But anyone who'd ever been in uniform could see the posture, the watchfulness that never left a professional. He carried a briefcase handcuffed to his wrist. He didn't speak. He simply clicked the case open, revealing a document folder inside a clear protective sleeve. On the cover, the emblem was unmistakable. An eagle perched above a shield, one talon clutching a lightning bolt, the other a set of scales. Somewhere near the loading dock, a forklift beeped continuously, abandoned by a driver who couldn't tear his eyes away. Rourke took the folder with both hands. He flipped it open, scanning the contents. When he looked up, his face didn't show surprise, just a resigned gravity, as if he'd expected this day for longer than any of them could imagine. The man with the briefcase spoke at last, quiet, precise. "You're the last confirmed asset. We need your clearance codes to finalize decommissioning." The room was silent, except for the hollow whine of the overhead fluorescent lights. Rourke closed the folder and handed it back. "Everything you need," he said, voice steady as a drumbeat. The agent locked the case again and gave a short nod. But before they could step away, something strange happened.